So what are your opinions on gentrification? So for example, in urban communities in New York, white communities coming in, opening up coffee shops, apartment complexes, and things like that. Do you think that that takes away from some of the culture in those communities? And do you think in that case maybe it's not such a good thing?
See, it's not really like that. I don't think that way.
Okay.
What I think is it's always an opportunity to open up something, right? That is always going back to people, right? When you look for like a business or something, when you open up a community or you open up a coffee shop, right? It's not like who is the owner or who is the person who owns that property.
Right.
It's more about who are all the customers, right? It can be anyone. It can be Indian. It can be Asian. It can be Spanish, whatever, right? So I don't think that way.
Okay.
I don't think that way.
All right. And so, do you think that? So you think that gentrification is a good thing or a bad thing, generally?
Generally, like it's a two side of it, right? It's a good and bad,
right.
but I would say it's not necessarily all the time bad and not necessarily all the time good. So.
Right. And obviously, some of the great positives are by diversifying a community, everyone gets to learn about other cultures and things
Right.
like that.
I'm like diversification is another thing, right? Like
Right.
you have different kind of people coming from different kind of backgrounds and coming from different kind of society, culture, stuff like that. And if you grew up in that environment, you gotta learn a lot more things. Then, hey, listen to this. Like, United States has the opportunity to learn from lot many communities,
Right.
right? Many Asian countries or African countries, they don't got that much diversification. They have one kind of people living there forever.
Right.
Like I grew up in India, I never learned anything about white people or something like that. Right? I'm here, I'm learning every day. I have a colleague who are Chinese people, who are Asian, who are white people, etc. So,
Right.
yeah.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So both my parents are immigrants, and like you mentioned, the United States is like probably one of the most diverse places in the world. Do you think that's one of the appeals that brings people here? I know you said you came to study, but like my father, he's an Italian national, for example, and he wanted to come just to learn more about other people. Do you think that's one of the main appeals of the United States? The fact that, like you said, you get to meet different cultures that you might have not met otherwise?
Right, true. Like US is a different country, I would say. US and United Kingdom, those kind of countries, you see a lot of immigrant people coming in. It's not only because they want to see US diversification. There are a lot of opportunities for them, more than what they have in back home, wherever they are coming from. But the country and the people in the United States, they are more open towards the diversification. So it's easy for anyone like me to come here and adopt different culture. So both ways, right? It's more diversification because a lot of people comes for different kind of opportunities. That's why society becomes diversified, and then you see a lot of different kind of people living in the society.
In terms of white gentrification, especially the part I know the most about is especially in New York City, where a white coffee shop will pop up, and then in a generally
What's a white coffee shop?
White-owned coffee shop. Sorry.
Okay.
And a lot of the time.
Do you usually know who owns a coffee shop?
Well, that's a good question.
I've almost never met a coffee shop owner. I never, unless it's like specifically like, the owner standing behind a small community coffee shop. I otherwise have no idea who owns these establishments.
From what I've studied and learned online, reading articles, my general consensus and what I learned from that, a lot of the time when these white-owned businesses come into communities that aren't very Caucasian, a lot of the time it leads to real estate owners looking to come into those communities. And in places like the Bronx, a lot of the communities that 20 years ago were almost all African American, those communities have definitely become more diversified, especially in New York, like the Bronx.
Where I live.
Oh, you live in the Bronx?
I do.
Yeah. So from what I read online, I saw a lot of instances or stories about communities that were 20 years ago almost completely African American, and as new stores and things opened up in those African American communities that weren't owned or managed by the community, say a a white-owned coffee shop, for example, that often leads to the curbside appeal of those neighborhoods and real estate agencies that want to move in and buy property, and that gentrification. Do you think that takes away from the cultural richness of those communities?
So that's a tricky one, because the gentrification is, the implication is things are getting better.
Right. Well, gentrification, I think it has a very negative connotation. I don't
Yeah.
think it's necessarily a positive or negative thing. I think it's definitely case by case.
Yeah.
But what I'm kind of asking about is, in the instance of that scenario I gave you, do you think that it's good that white people are moving in and increasing the value of property, even if that might take away from the richness of the community? It's a tough one.
It is a tough one, and that's a very tough question, because it's like not a one paragraph answer. There's a lot of things that go into that. To try to address your question, I would say it's almost moot. It's like it doesn't matter, because that's a tough one. Because in the situation, if you have white people moving in, real estate prices go up. The assumption is that the people that are there can no longer live there, so they're forced out.
And those African American communities come predominantly white.
Yeah. And then I would say then it absolutely ruins the cultural experience there. And then you have to wonder where people go.
Exactly.
Right? So the question is it beneficial?
I think the question I asked originally was, does the gentrification take away from the culture of the community?
Yeah. I would say that it does that.
I mean, just the word gentrification already has a negative connotation just in today's society, but there is instances where struggling communities, a business, although it is started by a white person, if it is employing people from the community and giving back to the community, I think it can be very beneficial. But at that point, is it really still gentrification? Because the whole idea of that concept is one race taking over a thing, which obviously isn't good.
Right, and I think a lot of the time, these things, like you say, where businesses start and help employing the community and give back, can be very positive, but a lot of the time it can lead to a cultural takeover.
I know.
And that's been seen in a lot of neighborhoods in New York City and the Bronx.
Yeah, because I mean, if you increase curb appeal, then people in real estate and people in construction, they supposed to make a lot of money, because unfortunately in the United States, Caucasians are the wealthiest race, and so they have the most money to spend. So that's why a lot of people try to attract them to neighborhoods where otherwise they wouldn't go to.